Hey, you know how in every video I make about abortion bans, I mention the fact that the data shows that when you restrict access to abortion, the number of abortions doesn't decrease, but the number of dead women does increase. Well, now that various states are free to ban abortion here in the US, we have even more data to test that hypothesis. Yay for data, I guess? And yes, spoiler alert, restricting access to abortion only hurts more people. If you'll recall, back in May of 2019, Texas instituted a ban on abortion after 22 weeks, one of the most restrictive anti-abortion laws in the country at the time. There's always going to be a bit of delay in crunching the data, so it's taken until 2022 for us to see how that affected maternal mortality. Texas's Maternal Mortality and Morbidity Review Committee has been issuing reports for the past 5 years, and obviously, this year's was going to be very important. Not only would it finally be covering maternal mortality from the year 2019, but it was also due to come out in September of 2022, several months after Texas banned abortion entirely and several months before the critical midterm elections, at which point new politicians would be elected, and they would need to review this data to see what sort of policies they should institute going forward. Unfortunately, and gosh, this is just so unfortunate and random and weird and unexpected, but for some completely unknown reason, that report was delayed until after the midterms were over and done with. In fact, they just released it now in December when everybody's on vacation. Weird and so unfortunate, because it turns out that, shit got pretty grim in Texas in 2019. Severe complications in pregnancy and childbirth increased significantly between 2018 and 2020 from 58.2 to 72.7 cases per 10,000 deliveries. At least 118 women died, and 90% of those deaths were considered preventable by the committee. Black patients saw the worst of it all, with inequality between them and white people getting worse than previous years. Black people saw a 10% increase in complications and were twice as likely to die in childbirth compared to white people. Of course, the report wasn't all bad news. The committee found that prior to the abortion ban, the enhanced maternal mortality ratio remained relatively stable from 2013 to 2017. Now, normally, I would not have even noticed this. I'm more interested in what happened to mortality after abortion was severely restricted in that state. But it came to my attention thanks to a post from a Redditor called Lightning over on the Skeptic subreddit, who pointed out the use of the word enhanced in that data. Lightning asserts a number of things, some of which I found to be valid after a lot of research. Some of them not so much, which we'll get into. But let's start with their very valid main point. The committee collected maternal mortality data in a non-standard way that makes that data impossible to compare to other states or countries. The CDC and the World Health Organization consider pregnancy-related deaths and pregnancy-related morbidity to be those cases that occur during pregnancy, delivery, or within 42 days of the end of pregnancy, which probably would not have occurred had that patient not been pregnant. Morbidity in this case means severe conditions that, if left untreated, would likely result in the death of the patient. It's worth noting that 42 days post-pregnancy is kind of a randomly chosen time period. So there are some researchers out there that push for that data to be considered for up to a year post-pregnancy. What's important is consistency when you're comparing these figures, since obviously those figures that follow patients for an entire year are going to have higher rates. So you just want to always make sure your data between comparisons are similar. And that's a good introduction to Texas's enhanced mortality rates. As with 42 days versus 365 days post-pregnancy, there are other ways that organizations like the CDC try to get everyone on the same page so we can compare apples to apples, data from different regions. For instance, the CDC provides a very clear standard for states to follow when reporting this data. Back in 2003, researchers suspected that maternal deaths were actually being undercounted, so they recommended that all states add a simple checkbox to death certificates that would indicate if the deceased had been pregnant within that suggested time period. That suggestion was instituted eventually by all states, but there were some hiccups. It took some states a few years to get that done, which meant that during that time period, the data wasn't directly comparable between all the states, from 2003 to 2017 when the last state finally got on board. The National Center for Health Statistics found that the checkbox did improve the accuracy of maternal mortality data, with about twice as many deaths caught with the checkbox. However, NCHS also found that while the addition of the checkbox allowed more pregnancies to be identified, it also likely introduced errors and overcounting with increasing age. For example, in deaths to women over age 44, NCHS found the rates were as much as 124.1 times those of younger women, and that in many of these cases, there was no accompanying cause of death information that supported the conclusion that the death was likely related to pregnancy. When Texas introduced that checkbox in 2010, the state did see the maternal mortality rate jump so much that it became big news and politicians started caring about the issue. And obviously that can't happen. Someone must debunk these numbers stat. All right, I'm just kidding. But the state did publish a study that appeared to show that most of that jump was due to human error. Specifically, authorities clicking that checkbox when the deceased was not, in fact, pregnant. From what I can tell, it seems that researchers accept that study. There really were a ton of screw-ups due to a very confusing launch of the online portal. Presumably that process has now been fixed in the past decade, but Texas is still trying to improve those numbers. Whether you think improve means make them more accurate or make Texas look less horrible is up to you, gentle viewer. I honestly cannot tell you, but I can tell you that this new report outright states that Texas's new enhanced maternal mortality is different from methods used by others, meaning the CDC, to calculate maternal mortality rates or ratios. Therefore, calculated enhanced maternal mortality ratios cannot be compared with other maternal mortality rates or ratios. Basically, the researchers took all of the deaths that would normally be included in maternal mortality figures, and they examined them to figure out whether they should really count. Thus, for 2016, 126 maternal deaths based on death certificates was thinned down to 55. And then that number was actually boosted back up to 82 by examining the deaths of about 90,000 other Texas women to see if any of those deaths were missed in the death certificates. So you can see, to Texas's credit, this wasn't just a one-way improvement to make the numbers smaller. They did add some back in. But when we look at the enhanced numbers preferred by Texas compared to the standard numbers preferred by the CDC, for every single year, they're significantly lower. 32.5 standard deaths per 100,000 in 2013 compared to 18.9 enhanced death. In 2014, it was 32 to 20.7, then 29.2 to 18.3, 31.7 to 20.7, and 33.5 to 20.2 for 2017. Again, to Texas's credit, the numbers are still pretty consistent over the years, so they have that going for them. It's a bit difficult to suss out exactly which cases Texas decided shouldn't count, but one thing they do call out is blood transfusions. That's a number that some researchers believe overly inflates the maternal morbidity numbers, since it's the most common emergency procedure on the CDC's list of indicators. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the patient was going to die without that blood transfusion. Because of that, transfusions are usually included in the data, but also sometimes called out as a separate item so you can see the numbers with and without blood transfusions. The Texas report also seems to dismiss traffic accidents unless they're ruled homicides or suicides. But that does make me wonder, how many of the people who died in those accidents would not have died had they not been pregnant? And moving forward, now that abortion is banned in Texas and doctors are required to make truly horrific decisions in life-threatening situations, how many of the people this year were denied medical care in order to prioritize the life of the fetus? If a person who is pregnant gets in an accident and the doctor has to pick the person who's pregnant or the fetus, what do they choose? Surely that should be considered maternal mortality. This report is damning, even aside from those numbers, but I do appreciate Lightning calling attention to this new enhanced mortality and morbidity rate. It means that we can no longer directly compare Texas's rate to other states, even though the enhanced rate that Texas put out would still make Texas worse for people who are pregnant than people in California, Illinois, Colorado, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, and they'd be tied with New York. It will be extremely important to keep that in mind in the coming years when we have more data about how many people will have died starting this year thanks to Texas banning abortion entirely. I'll end with a quick correction that I alluded to earlier, only because, I'm thanking this Redditor and pointing to their post. I want to say that they did get a few things wrong, as far as I can tell. Vehicular homicides are apparently counted in the enhanced data. The fact that they included extra maternal deaths from all females ages 5 and up doesn't make that data worse. It actually makes it more accurate. Yes, it's very rare for a 5-year-old to get pregnant, but this is the pool from which they were adding excessive deaths that weren't originally caught on the death certificates. So a wider pool is a good thing. And finally, probabilistic linkage doesn't mean that they're just making things up. That is an accepted scientific method used by statisticians to use statistical probabilities to say this death record most likely matches this birth record, increasing the chances that a maternal death will be included. Not huge deals for, a Reddit post, but because I'm linking to it, I just want to be sure that we're being as accurate as possible because I'm annoying like that. Anyway, that's it for today. Please stay safe, especially if you're a person with a working uterus in Texas or one of the other states where your bodily autonomy has been forcibly removed. It is now a more dangerous time for you, and the same politicians that have made it a more dangerous time are probably going to be doing their best to cover up what they've done to you.